planning might be a little bit narrow in its thinking, and maybe the people who go into planning, it could really do with a dose of healthy diversity within it to make sure we're meeting the needs of everybody and also just where this country is going.
On today's episode, we're taking a closer look at one of the most important pieces of infrastructure underpinning housing, economic development and sustainable communities across Ireland: water and wastewater services. For this conversation, I'm joined by Olwyn James, who is Senior Planning, Land and Utilities Manager at Uisce Éireann. We're going to talk about the organisation's role in the planning system, the challenges of delivering critical infrastructure, recent planning reform, and what all of this means for planners working across the public and private sectors. Olwyn, James, thank you so much for joining me.
Sean, it is a pleasure. I feel like I should compare this to Desert Island Discs for planners.
Yeah, just without the boring music, bits in between.
Harsh.
Not a judgment on your potential taste in music, but anyway, to get us started, can you explain who you are and where you work and how you got there?
Feels like a loaded question, but sure. My role at the moment is that I'm a Planning, Land and Utilities Manager in Uisce Éireann, working in Infrastructure Delivery Directorate in Uisce Éireann. We don't do short titles. I think I probably won the award for the longest title in the organisation. So what that involves is I manage a brilliant team of people, and we're involved in all of the consenting parts of getting our projects through the consenting regimes within infrastructure delivery. So that involves planning stuff, whether it's exempt development, making sure that we're adhering to all the kind of rules and regulations around exempt development, making Section 34 planning applications to local authorities, or direct applications to An Commission Pleanála as SID. And then also we manage all of our other licensing pieces too. So that could be into Mara, looking for max and lulls, a huge amount of road opening licenses, TII licenses, Irish Rail licenses, and then also within that space, applying to ESB for ESB connections, because we are a huge power user as well, and all of our infrastructure requires power. And then the other really big part of what we do is land, because the vast majority of our projects require land. We have a lot of linear development. So we go out and we look for sites and routes for our projects, and that means we engage with a lot of landowners too, and look at trying to get that land acquisition by agreement, but sometimes we end up in CPOs as well. So I've been working in Uisce Éireann for 11 years, I'll be honest. I thought when I moved into Uisce Éireann, there might be about 5 years of good crack and good fun and lots of learning, but 11 years later, I'm every day still. And before that, I worked in local authority for more than 11 years as a local authority planner. So I am a planner by profession, but I think I do probably a lot more than planning work these days. I didn't start out my career as a planner. I have a degree in art history and English. So I took a kind of a long wavering road into planning. I actually started out working in architectural conservation for quite a number of years. And I think it was when I was in that job, I probably realized that I really enjoyed the whole world of planning. I probably just didn't know that planning was a career. I think I was probably one of those pesky people when politicians were called to the door during county development plan reviews and talk about zoning and schools and transport. So I think I was always interested in that world. And then when I was in conservation, I thought it would be interesting to take my interest in design and placemaking and do it in a different way and look at kind of plan making and decision making. So I wandered back to do some more college stuff and went back into the planning degree.
And I won't ask if you ever regret it, but do you think there's many people out there, I guess, who could do that sort of stuff? Or what does your background give you in your work as a planner that you think really has been valuable? That sort of slightly meandering journey and slightly unique perspective, because you're not working in conservation now necessarily, but I'm sure that's possibly part of what you're doing as well. What do you think that background has given you? And because obviously we need to get more people into it, and something that you and I are involved in is trying to increase the pipeline of planners. Are there ways to engage people who are interested in planning but who maybe haven't considered it as a career? And what sort of added value do you think having a slightly unusual or a slightly different route into it can bring you?
I think, Sean, everybody actually is fundamentally interested in planning because it's about how the world works. It impacts everything we do every day, whether it's about how we get around or where we might live or where we travel to or where we work. Or I always kind of talk about even how the food gets to our plate. It impacts everything. So everybody actually is really interested in planning and how your world operates. Maybe it's a little bit about people don't think they have the skills for it. But what I have found is coming from my background, that experience of maybe just seeing things from a different perspective and seeing the value of everything it is that you do, whether, for my world, it was around placemaking and culture and heritage and the impact that high quality design can bring to kind of your good experience of a place, that's really valuable when you come into the planning sphere. And I think there's probably kind of different nuggets of like that kind of around the table. So whether you've got experience in engineering or conservation or energy or whatever it might be, it's almost how your brain works and how you can bring those concepts to the table to think about things a little bit differently, because we live and operate in a world that is just incredibly diverse. And we need to have people with that diverse way of thinking to make sure that we're creating a world that works for everybody. So whether it's people with additional needs or people who think a little bit differently or whatever it might be. So I think planning might be a little bit narrow in its thinking, and maybe the people who go into planning it could really do with a dose of healthy diversity within it to make sure we're meeting the needs of everybody, and also just where this country is going as well. Whether it's economists who bring something to the table or whatever it might be. So that's probably a little bit of work that we need to do as planners is landing that message that there's space at the table for everybody, and that richness of additional ways of thinking would be hugely beneficial.
And so to go back to the day job, Uisce Éireann obviously is now a central player in infrastructure delivery and I suppose across the objectives of the functioning of the planning system. But for listeners who maybe don't interact with Uisce Éireann a lot, are only aware of it kind of doing certain things, but maybe not the breadth of what your sort of role involves, can you just explain a little bit about the stuff that Uisce Éireann does, its role within the planning system, and also I guess really it is such a key player in the national infrastructure or architecture. It'd be really useful to just tease that out, because it isn't just one thing that Uisce Éireann does, and your role seems to be across a whole gamut of functions and activities and roles.
Yeah, it's really funny when you start that off by saying people probably aren't really aware of Uisce Éireann, and I think that kind of sums it up, because everybody actually is aware of what we do, but I think we all are guilty of taking our services for granted, like me included. You flip a switch, you just expect power to come into that switch or whatever it might be. So every time you turn on your tap, you have an expectation that water is going to flow, or you flush your toilets, that it's going to operate the way it should operate. And it's only when things go slightly awry that you realize, oh, hang on a minute, that just doesn't appear like magic. So we supply 1.7 million litres of water every day to people in this country. And we treat 1.2 million litres of wastewater every day and return it into its natural environment. So what we're doing is providing safe, secure, sustainable water services to the country. And that fundamentally is the bedrock of how society works. And even if you think back to your old history or geography days, you would always have seen settlements forming in a bend in a river, because water is that important. That's where people always look to form new societies, and civilization is fundamentally tied to water. We then, when it comes into the planning sphere, that's kind of how planning works, is that you can't have towns and villages or economic development without it having water services there. So we have now kind of set ourselves up to kind of mirror the planning world a little bit in terms of kind of strategic plan making and then those lower tier plans. So we're kind of echoing that. So we now have a number of strategic plans. We have the National Water Services Strategic Plan. We have a National Water Resources Plan, which is an incredibly important document where we've gone off to look at how the supplies are operating around the country, what's sustainable, what is less sustainable, what we have to think about into the future in terms of where we can take supplies from and treat and get it into the networks. And we're doing the same now on the wastewater side as well. So that's one that's brewing. So effectively what we're doing is looking at a 25-year plan around what our infrastructure needs are, aligning that then with the national planning framework. So that's kind of going hand in hand. And other utilities do the same. ESB and Airgrid would have something similar. Then we go down a level into the plan making stage. And that's the one that kind of is what people are probably most familiar with, is just how does it impact them in their day-to-day world. So when local authorities are preparing their county development plans, we would have a huge role to play in that. Now, also when you think about it, how different the world is for local authorities since Uisce Éireann has been established, that used to be something that fell within their remit. They were the Water Services Authority as well as the Planning Authority. They could plan for their water requirements within their own kind of framework. But now that responsibility sits with us. So there's a huge onus on us to make sure that they're getting the information that they need to enable them to plan their future capacity. So we've got capacity registers, and that looks to see what our capacity looks like. And then we use that to inform local authorities about where they should zone, whether we're able to service that land in a time that they need that land to be zoned, and kind of reduce the delays around that as well. So you don't want hope value around land that can't actually be serviced as well. So to make it a bit more realistic, and then to look at the timelines around when we can provide that infrastructure. And then we align that up with our own investment plan as well to make sure that everything is tidied up. A really good example of that, Sean, is, when government announced that this country needs an additional 300,000 homes, and went with an ask to the local authorities to look at their core strategies and their zoning around that and their housing targets. We were kind of a key player in that. So I think it was about 5,000 hectares that ended up being additionally zoned as part of that process. And that would have come into us, and our team would have looked at that to see, could that be serviced? Was that viable? So that's kind of a tangible kind of example of what we do there. But then we're obviously a statutory consultee as well for developers and applicants when they're going into the planning system. So if you have a housing developer who's making an application to the local authority, and the local authority needs to have some certainty around whether that's a viable proposition or not, and can it be serviced? Is this going to realise the housing targets that they need? So we will make observations on that, and we'll do an assessment about whether that connection can be provided, or what type of infrastructure requirements might be needed to upgrade that. And then obviously there's our own stuff too. We're a big developer in our own right, so we engage in the planning authority hugely in that. So within Uisce Éireann, we've basically got 3 planning functions, so people might not be aware of. Planning is a huge part of that big engineering beast that is Uisce Éireann. So we've got a 4 planning section that looks after all of that engagement with county development plans and national planning frameworks and RSESs and all of that. And we have the Connection Developer Services planning team, who are engaging with development management side of the house and local authorities and LLGs and Christian Canola. And then you've got the planning team within infrastructure delivery, getting our stuff through the system.
I don't think people maybe, as you said, fully appreciate the breadth of that, or how it mirrors maybe the kind of traditional planning functions and things like that. But I suppose Uisce Éireann's also can come in for a lot of criticism and be seen as a blockage and a barrier and all that sort of stuff. And look, I suppose resourcing and the long-term investment trajectory would be blamed for that. I think some of it is, you've probably heard all these criticisms before, but what do you think people need to appreciate? I suppose the thing that strikes me is that there is a long-term strategy linked to the national planning framework there, and that is a core part of what Uisce Éireann is looking to do and will do, and it underlines the importance maybe of that national planning framework, and that's not something that you can change, or a shift that you can kind of just turn and then expect Uisce Éireann to be able to kind of follow it without having implications for other stuff. But how well appreciated is that complexity, the fact that there is a plan-led approach mirroring the national plan-led approach, I guess? Do you think there's maybe more that can be done to promote that? Or, and look, this is conversation that I've had with maybe even people like they're in the podcast with the planning regulator and things like that. Is it just inevitable that Uisce Éireann is going to come in for criticism or be pointed to as a break because that's where it was, and if it wasn't you, it would be somebody else? And I know obviously it comes up when infrastructure, energy capacity comes up as well, but what's it like, I guess is the question, to work within that space where you're coming under a lot of pressure and a lot of importance?
I think showing criticism isn't a bad thing. I think it keeps us all on his toes. So I don't think we're ever going to be in a position where we're looking to be given a clap on the back all the time. because that's not a good place to be either. Like, I think one of the things I really value about working in Uisce Éireann is that genuinely we listen to what is being said to us about not being good enough at times. And we genuinely look to see if we can do better. And then at other times, what we're looking to do, and I think we've done a very good job in the last couple of years in terms of promoting what it is we do and adding that message around the importance of infrastructure delivery, and that we are responsible for delivering water services, but we cannot do it on our own. We're the delivery arm of the state, but there's a life cycle for delivering infrastructure, and there are other roles of responsibility sitting with other agencies and arms of the state to make sure that we get that done, because effectively what we're trying to do is enable this country to be the best it can be and serve the people of this country with drinking water that is fit for human consumption, and we protect our environment and we enable homes to be built and jobs to be created and held onto. So we're very honest, I think, about that piece. But back to your bit about the kind of the plan making piece, I do think that under planning reform and the work that the department have done in the Act and looking at that long-term focus and the forward planning piece, really the heart of what the new Act is about. And I think that we probably need to acknowledge that that's what the Act is doing, is that it's looking at that forward-thinking element and making sure that we're planning correctly and into the future, and we're stitching everything together and aligning what we do better. We're just not going to see the fruits of that for a while, I think, and that's probably maybe a little bit frustrating for people. But absolutely, like, I think fundamentally when it comes to how the world works and planning, we're not landing the message because everybody is reactive. Like, it's just human nature. We've got a problem today and we want to deal with it today, or we want a solution today. We're not great as a species about looking into the longer term and what we have to do to make sure things are okay in the future. And that's why we are where we are with climate change. You know, again, another example of we're all starting to feel pain of that now, but, you know, it takes a little bit of a pain point, and sometimes you have to go over a cliff to understand exactly what it is you need to do. There is a responsibility across the board around thinking, what is it we want? What is our policy directive here? What are our objectives? What's the plan, how we're going to get there? And how do we pull in all of the arms of the state who are responsible for achieving those and making sure the mandate is really, really clear, that we're all working towards the same thing? And then it kind of comes back to the piece maybe that is being highlighted in the Accelerated Infrastructure Task Force around public acceptance, the common good. And that's a really, really complicated idea. You don't just tell people what is going to happen or what needs to happen or how we're going to do it. So there's a really big kind of philosophical question there around, even psychological question about how we get people thinking about what it is we have to do and how we get there. And again, it's kind of always back to your point about how do we encourage a variety of people into planning. Like, that's another big area that's needed, because that's a big piece of how human behavior. How do we tackle the human behavior piece? That is an essential ingredient of what good planning looks like. So it's good pieces there for somebody to do, I think.
And in that context, and you mentioned climate change and the housing delivery requirements, population growth, biodiversity emergency, all those pressures as well. What are the main priorities for Uisce Éireann at the moment, and how is it working within the planning system, or what's the role of the planning system in delivering those priorities?
I think you can't really set out just a clear list of what our priorities are without understanding what the context is. Then it's not tangible to people. Like, why is that a priority? But you don't understand the context. So we have had decades of underinvestment in our infrastructure. And again, it's a bit like just the question you asked about forward thinking. That pause on investment is something we're dealing with now. We're trying to play catch up of all of those decades that were lost in that investment. The population growth is hugely impactful on our assets, just can't cope with the level of growth that we're experiencing at the moment. We're now up to, 5.3 million people living in this country. Climate change is just an unbelievable thing to try and contend with in the environment that we work in. that chronic undersupply of housing and our role in trying to address that is something that's really important. And then the other piece that people might be aware of as well is just that transition that we're experiencing at the moment, moving from a local authority water services sector into a single public utility. And those operators at our plant who are the key to how we keep our stuff going every day. And so when we talk about infrastructure delivery, it really tried to need to make it tangible to people. Like, what does that mean? So we invested, I think it was about 2.3 billion euro last year. And when I joined Uisce Éireann, the fund we had was about 300 million euro. So you can see just the trajectory of where we're going with stuff. And what does that mean on the ground for people? So last year, we took 60,000 people off the remedial action list. That meant their drinking water was improved. About 30,000 people off the long-term boil water notices. Again, imagine when you talk about what we take for granted, it meant that those people could then be sure about the water that they were drinking. Our drinking water compliance now is at 99.8% compliance with the Drinking Water Directive. That is phenomenal, particularly when you think about the dispersed population that we have and just the sheer number of small drinking water plants we have around the country. That's incredible. 27 water treatment plants were upgraded last year. When I joined Uisce Éireann, and I found this phenomenal when I joined, there were 50 towns and villages around the country that had no wastewater treatment. So if you lived in some of those beautiful towns and villages around the country, or you went to visit them, when you flushed the loo, that went straight out into the environment untreated. It's phenomenal to think that existed in this country back then. Solving the problem is really complicated because what you're doing is going into existing communities. You're trying to intercept the network that's there and build a treatment plant. So it's really hard to have those conversations with those communities and try and identify a site for them. So now, as of this year, 39 of those are sorted and 11 of them are in hand. And that's an incredible achievement. Our compliance rate under the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive now sits at about 93%. So it's come up from 80% as well. And Arklow was one of the big towns that we solved last year. 135 towns and villages are now compliant with the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, and they've also got some capacity for growth. One of the other pieces that we have our own lab now in Limerick, and we probably don't talk about it enough, where previously we used to have to send out all our testing, and we're doing more testing as well in the water space. We used to have to send that out to private companies. We now have our own centre of excellence down in Limerick, and that has huge potential in terms of innovation research as well within our own gift. That's phenomenal. We issued pre-connection inquiries for about 181,000 homes and made offers of connections for about 40,000 units. So when we talk about priorities, that's what it means to people on the ground. This is why we have a priority list, because this is what we want to do. We want to make sure that people have water that's safe for drinking consumption and all of those other things I talked about. So absolutely, the number one priority for us is that housing piece. 300,000 homes that have to be delivered. In addition, to by 2030, we don't build houses, but we have to make sure that developers can connect to homes. I can't talk enough about the impact in the eastern region of the country in terms of what's happening with water and wastewater and how on a precipice we are on that knife edge. When we talked about maybe sometimes you have to go over a cliff, we're trying really, really hard to make sure we don't go over a cliff with water and wastewater in the eastern region, but we are so close. In May, we had our demand went to 685 litres a day, which is the highest demand in the country that we've ever seen. So it's really, really risky. If you think about where water is coming from in the eastern region, we're serving about 1.8 million people live in the eastern region. We're serving about 85% of them, and we're serving them with 40% of water in the River Liffey. That small enough river, and we're taking 40% of it out, serving 85% of the population. That is completely unsustainable in environmental terms. But the other risk is just the exposure we are to anything happening with that river and what could happen to the population in the east should that go down. So what we are looking to do is, obviously we've got a project in the system now to take water from Partine Basin from the Shannon system, which represents about 2% of the water in that system, and then serve the Eastern and Midlands region with water there and to give us the that we're going to have water into the future. That's been on the brew since for many, many years. We've been engaging with landowners since 2016. But I probably can't emphasize enough how big of a priority it is, not just for Uisce Éireann or for this country, to make sure that we alleviate the knife edge that we're on in that part of the world. Then there's the wastewater, because water and wastewater go hand in hand. We've got the Greater Dublin Drainage Project, which came out of probably a decade within the system between planning and the courts. And this is a really good week for us in Uisce Éireann, because preliminary construction works have commenced on that project. And that's an amazing milestone to have reached. And the main works will probably start at the end of the year. So really getting there with that project as well. So the other big issue for us is funding. So when I talk about the underinvestment that's happened to date, we have to tackle that by making sure that we've got enough funding moving forward. So I think we've got a really good track record of delivering infrastructure. We do talk about the barriers a lot, but we probably don't talk about those success stories enough to show that we can actually get stuff built and delivered. So we need about €2 billion to kind of unlock the potential of this country and make sure we undertake a transformation program. Then there's the climate change piece, and making sure that we've got projects that can adapt to climate. And we would say that the water supply project is also a climate adaptation project. We're really feeling the impacts of drought, even though we have massive downpours of rain at times. January is probably the wettest January we've had in a long time. We don't have enough resilience within our system. So we have to make sure that we've got enough assets constructed to deal with that. We're also looking to move to a low carbon utility by 2040. That takes a huge amount of work. And then that kind of biodiversity emergency, realise our biodiversity action plan as well. And again, we're pedaling to keep up. We're pedaling to try and catch up with the deficits that are there. And at the same time, on the horizon, we've got new directives coming our way. So we've got the new drinking water directive coming our way, the recast wastewater treatment directive coming our way. So we're then going to have to look at all of our plans again to see what it is we need to make sure that we're compliant with those. And I couldn't end a conversation without talking about our guys and, our people who go to site every day, because we've got a huge funding bundle, a huge amount of projects. But one of our biggest priorities is making sure people are safe. So if we are sending out huge crews to construct all of those new assets, we want to make sure they come home every day the same way they went to work. So that's a massive, massive concern for us, particularly when you just got the volume of construction activity that is happening at the moment. They need to make sure that safety is still a top priority within that construction detail. We have to manage our supply chain, because everybody is doing the same thing. We've got transport, power, us, housing, everybody trying to draw from the same pool. And we have to make sure that supply chain has got a vision of what work is coming our way. And then you think about the impact on communities, because we are all going into the same neighborhood trying to get infrastructure delivered. And we are acutely aware that is painful for communities, particularly when we're in there digging up roads, trying to get assets into the ground. So to do all of that, we need to make sure that all of those barriers that are there are lifted, and we can try and do things, maintain what we're doing, do it faster, keep inflation at bay, because the longer it takes us to do things, the more expensive it gets. And then more expensive it gets, it means you've got less money to do other stuff. So.
And I want to talk about maybe how we can do stuff faster, or those barriers, in a second. But one thing I wanted to just ask you about was that precipice that you mentioned, or that knife edge. And I think for some people, they might think of hosepipe bans and stuff like that. But what could that look like? Are we talking about the water equivalent of blackouts and brownouts and stuff that you hear about, no more data center connections and stuff like that? Like, is it stopping development or stopping connecting nearly done development? Is that potentially the scenario that we are looking at?
You're kind of answering the question yourself there, Sean. It's reducing maybe pressure at night, in the first instance, outages and staying in. And we don't want to be there. Like, this is an amazing country that we live in. We have incredible assets available to us. To think that we would trip ourselves up. There's enough stuff going on in the external world that we don't have control over, but we have control over this. And to think that we would be our own barrier to something is unforgivable.
And then to get into that delivery piece then, so can you talk a little about the relationship between how Uisce Éireann works with local authorities and then planning authorities and other actors within the wider planning system? And Are there things that you think we're doing well when it comes to aligning, I suppose, planning and infrastructure delivery? And is there stuff that is going to improve or can improve? And then I'd also like to talk to you about the Act and the regs and things like that that are coming under it. But generally, what's that sort of relationship like now between you and the other actors? And where do you think that's going?
So I'd always say we would always look to improve. Continuous improvement should be on everybody's agenda, and we are the same, us and everybody else. We always look to try and do better. But in terms of our relationship with planning authorities, it's always been good. I think we describe it as highly collaborative, but what's happening now that's slightly different is that it's becoming increasingly more proactive. Now, I think we probably all have T-shirts in work that should say early engagement, because that's what we talk about all the time. That's the bit that probably needs to continuously improve, is the earlier all of the actors engage, the better the outcomes are. So back to that kind of land zoning piece, the earlier there's engagement, the clearer we can be about that capacity constraints and stuff. Now, I think, have to improve in terms of our communication to the planning authorities around when infrastructure is going to be delivered. What's our program for delivering that infrastructure? That's definitely a dial that's shifting internally in Uisce Éireann. We've identified 71 settlements around that, around that housing target. And we're looking to see if we can be clearer with planning authorities around what the program is for delivering that and when it'll come on, so that they can then communicate back to their partners as well and have greater certainty and clarity around. That's always a little bit of a movable feast, though, because we don't necessarily have control when our projects go into the system. We don't necessarily have control over when they'll come out, particularly because we have so many consents that we have to get. And then sometimes our funding can go up and down as well. It's like the T's and C's at the bottom of an ad. Sometimes that goes up and down, and that can be problematic as well. But definitely proactive engagement is happening, and we are definitely improving around how we can engage as well. We made a commitment under Programme for Government that we were going to do early engagement in the LRD space as well with local authorities and developers. I think that's working really, really well. There's probably other lessons that could be learned. I always find that all of us as people, we've got information in our head, but it's communicating that information is kind of the secret to success. So when it comes to the zoning piece and phasing and sequencing, there might be a colour on a map and there might be some text and development plan around what the housing targets are, but the yield and the density on particular sites actually really matters to us in terms of just even sizing our infrastructure. So that could probably be a little bit better in terms of making sure that we're sizing our infrastructure and planning our infrastructure to really meet the needs and the expectations of what a site is going to yield. The other bit that's really emerging as an issue for us is the road space, is when we're delivering infrastructure in roads. And there's probably a bit more collaboration that we need to do collectively in that space around when land is zoned and when permission is granted and there's an expectation it's going to be serviced. We actually have to carry out those works. And it then becomes very difficult for us and everybody else, including the roads authority or generally the planning authority, around how we plan for that and minimise disruption and align ourselves and other agencies. So if ESB want to go in at the same time, or telecoms or whoever it might be. So that's definitely something that could definitely improve. The other bit that we find really difficult is when we've got projects that go into the planning system, is how we are communicated with, because they kind of go into a vacuum and it becomes almost impossible for us to understand when it is going to come out of that system and what the steps are along that decision-making roadmap as well. So if you've got something that is going in, you think you know what's going to happen to that application when it's in the system, but invariably something else happens. And GDD is a really good example of that. But the system as a whole needs to, I think, improve in how it's communicating with applicants around what are the steps, what is happening, what's going to happen next, particularly on those large scale projects where we're trying to manage a huge amount, whether it's landowners or whether it's the department and funding or regulators or even local authorities who have an expectation that an asset is going to arrive at a certain time. So there's definitely a massive room for improvement in that space as well.
And I want to separate the planning process from the consenting process, and you talked about all the consents that you maybe need to get, but it's difficult I think it's difficult not to maybe bundle them together sometimes. So we obviously have the ongoing implementation of the 2024 Planning and Development Act. We've got a lot of work around accelerating infrastructure. What, from a Uisce Éireann point of view or from an infrastructure delivery point of view, what do you think is going to be most significant there? And is it some stuff that is already happening or is already commenced, or is there something coming down the line that you think is really going to move the dial and maybe improve everybody's infrastructure delivery experience, I guess, not just Uisce Éireann?
For us, we would always say that planning is just one part of this very complicated jigsaw for us, because it's not completely unique to us, but I think we probably have a much more complex consenting regime than lots of other developers. So we have to go to MARA for a MUL, for reusage license for SI, then get a MAC, marine area consent, before you get into planning. Then we go into planning, whether it's local authority or SID. We have to get land, and land is incredibly complicated, that piece. And then we've got the final bit, which is wastewater discharge license or water abstraction license as well through the EPA. And all of those happen independently, sequentially. None of that happens at the same time. And each and every one of those, not all of them, but there is the possibility that each of them might be subject to a second environmental assessment, whether it's AA or EIA. That brings with it cost, time, risk. And then each and every one of those decisions could be subject to its own judicial review as well. So that's a minefield. All of that is a minefield. So I think probably how the dial has turned right now, at this moment in time, is that everybody's talking about it. So we were trying to deal with this, navigate this complex situation, and try and explain to people why it took us 5 to 7 years or 7 to 10 years or 10 years or more to deliver infrastructure. And that just seems mind-bogglingly slow to everybody. But I think we've finally been able to land that message that it's really complicated. There's all these separate processes. So I think that's probably the biggest part that's come out of reform, is that there's an acknowledgement and understanding of all the different steps and an appreciation that maybe that's not right, that we should be able to run some of these at the same time. Are all of those environmental assessments required, particularly when you think about EIA? Maybe it was on the table before the Water Framework Directive and before the Habitats Directive. And now that landscape is completely changed. There's other checks and balances in place now to make sure that we're doing right by the environment. So that, I think, is probably the biggest thing, is just that understanding and this momentum that exists now to try and get the pace of delivery faster. Maybe under Accelerated Infrastructure Task Force, there's a simplification unit that is being set up. And that is an incredibly important unit for us, because we would be hopeful that that is going to bring around some streamlining and some simplification and maybe reduce the burden whilst achieving the same outcome. So when we talk about this being a burden, it's not just a burden for us as an applicant. It's a burden on the decision makers, because they're working in a very complex arena as well. It's very difficult on statutory consultees who are being asked to make observations on different consents for the same project. How are they supposed to engage with maybe a MAC and planning and a wastewater discharge license? And they're maybe limited on the CBO side of the house. So it's not just us as applicants that makes it cumbersome for. When we talk about resourcing challenges, like we know, Sean, like we talked about this loads about the challenges that face the sector and, the deficit in resourcing out there. So one of the best things we can do is not just look to see how we can build that resource into the future, but reduce the burden that's there on them at the moment and see if we can take some of that away without impacting the outcome and make sure they can focus on the stuff that they need to focus on better. So that's something that we're really keen to see. So the fact that we're talking about it is really good. Have we seen the outcome of it yet? No, not yet. Except I would say, like we are seeing things like MARA have introduced Section 90 piece for us, which is huge, deeming this fit and proper, which is reducing the administrative burden in that process. And I think everybody's finding the benefit there. And that's the bit that I'd like to see replicated across the board. There's more reform coming, and we really need that reform, particularly in the regulation space. So there's an expectation that the regulations will be published and part 4 of the Act will be commenced in autumn. And part 4 will allow those mandatory timelines for commission canola, which is hugely important. Now, there's another piece of work to happen around that. Timelines are timelines, but we need to make sure the positive outcomes at the end of that timeline. And we need to make sure that the early engagement piece is captured so the issues are all closed out before an application goes into the system. So there's probably another big piece of work that needs to be done around enabling that early engagement to happen. So that's probably where the Critical Infrastructure Bill or Infrastructure Act now comes to play, where it's kind of mandating arms of the state to prioritise and engage and make sure that those issues are closed out before those projects land in the system, or when decisions are being made, that collaboration is happening around that decision making to make sure there isn't any conflict in outcomes from that. My hope would be that that's setting the tone for what should happen in the future, that it will make that normal practice, that you won't need to be on a list, that that's just what we do. So a lot of it is about process and legislation and amendments. But for me, a huge amount of it should be around behaviours and culture, and that piece about your role and responsibility in achieving state objectives and how those organisations need to be facilitated and enabled to make sure that that can happen at the end of the day. But then back to the regulations, there's huge potential and scope there to maybe simplify how planning applications are made, or particularly for us, expanding exempted development and taking those works out of the planning system within strict parameters and enabling planning authorities to just deal with the more complicated stuff. And then there's a review ongoing around EIA at the moment. And that's really important to us because currently we have very, very low thresholds for EIA in wastewater treatment plants, completely out of kilter with other European jurisdictions. And the knock-on effect for that is it's huge for us, not just in terms of exempt development, but confusion around what requires EIA, particularly when we're upgrading our assets. And the other knock-on effect is in the wastewater discharge license space as well, because so we need to see that amended and then it to be followed through in other pieces of legislation as well. So there's a good bit done, particularly around advocating for infrastructure and building that momentum. So what we really need to see is the outcomes of those proposed changes. Maintaining momentum is really important, and really monitoring the outcomes. We would always say is it's not about the numbers of decisions that are made, it's about the impactful decisions that are made. So are we measuring decisions in terms of achieving state objectives rather than just numbers and KPIs? Ultimately, we can't afford to not do better in this space because, again, like I said earlier, it's fault is in our gift to control, so we're responsible for making it better.
And before we wrap up, looking back over your career so far, is there any project or initiative or achievement or something that you've delivered or an outcome that you are particularly proud of?
All of it. But if you're going to push me, like put in my collar stuff, there's probably 2 really. One is in that schools program I talked about earlier. For me, education is really important. I spent a lot of time in education. I think it's incredibly important. There was one particular school where there just were so many barriers and people just kept saying it's never going to happen. We're never going to get this school built. At the time, this little school was in prefabs that weren't fit for occupancy, squatting on the playground of another school. And eventually, I wouldn't take no for an answer. And we got a site for that school in the foothills of the Dublin Mountains, and our generations of kids are going into a school environment where they will not only, I hope, enjoy learning, but they get to hear birds tweeting and they see a river run by and they get to be in a really, really good environment. And for me, a good environment is, I don't know, maybe it's undervalued, but for me, a good, high quality environment is just so conducive to make you a happier person. And then the other one is Arklow. So I've already referenced Arklow. Arklow is a project we opened last year, and it's an incredibly proud moment, I think, for so many reasons, because that town had no treatment. It was a large foreign treated agglomeration, and we've been trying to solve that problem for a long, long time, as had Wicklow County Council before us. And there was such grit and determination within our organisation, and the people in Arklow to solve this problem. But what's particularly good about it, not only is it solved, it's also the most wonderful piece of architecture as well. And so it has won a good few awards, including the President's Award in the IPI. And when I go down to Arklow, and there's a particular moment in the route down there when I get into the building and I kind of catch my breath. It's beautiful. So for me, it's kind of, not only is it solved the problem of untreated agglomeration, it's really making a comment about the value of good design, but the responsibility on public agencies to leave the place better than they found it as well. And that's what we did in Arklow isn't appropriate everywhere, but it is appropriate at that location. And the architects and the engineers and the contractors did this unbelievable job of taking to life what was a beautiful model that was created, and they brought that to life. I think it's a huge testament to everybody who was involved in that project, but how the people of Arklow came to the table on that project was just phenomenal. They were just incredible and heavily engaged. So yeah, Arklow all the way.
And finally, is there anything that we haven't covered that you think is important for planners and other listeners to understand when it comes to the role of Uisce Éireann, and then also the delivery of infrastructure in the country?
I think there's probably a little bit there about people who maybe are not in favour of something tend to advocate loudly about what maybe they have an issue with or find problematic. But I think there's an onus on all of us maybe to advocate for stuff that we do want to happen. And we do have a responsibility to make sure that we are doing the best in this country that we can do. I think we probably just need to use our voice a little bit louder. What would be my kind of call out for people is, let's get behind these projects. Let's see if we can get things moving faster and make sure that we're using hard-earned funds to deliver more and give everybody assurances that they can have jobs and future homes and future schools where they need to be, all of that good stuff. How the world works is what it all comes down to, and it kind of sits on all of our shoulders to make sure that that happens.
Olwyn, thanks a million for joining me.
Fun. It was a blast.
If you would like to find out more about what we covered in this episode, you'll find notes, links, and more in the description area of this podcast. Do remember to press follow for our show so you'll get the next episode automatically, and remember to share it with a friend in the sector. Just tell them to search Irish Planning Institute on their podcast app. Our podcast today was produced by dustpod.io and brought to you by the Irish Planning Institute. From me, Sean O'Leary, thank you for listening.